All right, hello everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome to the session right before lunch where we're gonna get through a lot of it so you guys don't start kind of trickling out, but we're gonna do a lot. We have a very ambitious presentation for you here today. We're gonna go through and do a couple of introductions. We have several gentlemen here on our panel, and let's look at, here we go. So if we start with Eric.
Sure. Nice to meet everyone. Eric Fromm. I'm with TrustWave. Been there about 6 years. I run the security solutions engineering team for the Americas. And just some of our superpowers is we specialize in Microsoft, so a lot of clients are purchasing the E5 license. We're helping them with that journey. And I think some of our other superpowers are really around CMMC, which is something that's it's now a requirement for folks that are working with the federal government.
Right. Forrest Knippel, Vice President of Channel, and apparently like 3 other titles. With Coro Cybersecurity. I will tell you, I've been there for coming up on 3 years, which is almost the entirety of the actual channel portion of what we've been doing with that business. We went from 0 to 100 as a channel program within Coro in just the last few years, even though it's 10 plus years old. Our superpower is pretty simple. Like, we are a platform for multiple point solutions that you can go and take to your small and mid-sized businesses. We already have several people in here that have used us for some very large opportunities, but I will tell you, if it's in that, let's call it 250 and below, we should be your first call.
Excellent, thank you. Paul, sir.
Hi there, Paul Van Larup. I'm the Director of Channel Sales Engineering for the Americas at Cato Networks. Cato's superpower is the convergence of network and security together in the secure access service edge or SASE space. And I happen to be out of Bozeman, Montana. So happy to get out of the snow to get here.
Thank you, welcome. And Tony.
Everyone, good morning. Tony Lauro from Akamai Technologies, Director of Security Strategy and Technology. Been with Akamai for almost 12 years, and I'm part of a global group that basically helps our business understand what our customers want. So when we're looking at mergers and acquisitions, new emerging technology, our team is how we kind of translate that and integrate it into the business. Akamai's superpower, I would say, is having global visibility. We see about 30% of the world's web traffic pass through our network every day. So applying collective intelligence insights into the solutions that we provide, which are enterprise, inside your network, all the way to protecting your organization from DDoS and web application firewall protection, is applying context using that global visibility we have.
Excellent. So amazing panel, right? Some really, really great companies and partners that we've been working with quite a bit on the security side. We're gonna go through a lot about talking about data is the new gold. And so all of our partners here, SMEs, right, really great people. We don't have time for QA. We're gonna get through a lot of it, but definitely find them later as well as we get through this. They have a lot of really excellent information and really, really great partnership. So we're talking about data and why data is the new gold, why we're talking about this, right, is that we have just some stats here. I'm not gonna go through all of these, of course, but data is at the root of a lot of breaches, right? So why are they trying to get into these networks? What are they ultimately trying to get? It's data, right? They want to have data for lots of different bad guy reasons, but that's going to be the root of it. So when we look at the slides, there's 3 different points that I want to make here on these slides. What we're looking at here is a global average weekly cyber attacks per industry. This is every week. These are going to be the increases, very few decreases, from Q3 2023, so last year, quarter 3, to just this past quarter, Q3 2024. The highlight here, the top one, at the very, education and research. When we talk about data, that's a lot of the really great data, right? This is new data, this is new research. We have a lot of different, universities generating some great stuff. We talk about MIT, we talk about other different research organizations doing things within AI, which we don't always love talking about sometimes, but a lot of that's in research, right? So up 119% weekly cyber attacks that they're seeing just in that quarter. The second one down, vendor software. So how are they getting the people who have other people's data, right? How we store data, how you connect data and process it. So your software vendors up 142% weekly. Hardware vendors, same kind of idea there too, right? 191% increase cyber attacks average weekly. That's a lot of attacks, right? They're really, really trying to get into data. They're really, really trying to do that, and there's a lot of different ways they're able to, but of course, there's a lot of different ways that we need to look at protecting it. Setting the stage a little bit to kind of give us an idea, a visual of how we're talking about how data is inside of an organization, how it processes through different things that touch it. We know that some of our data, traditional controls, everybody probably has, right? Everybody has firewalls, and we look at that bottom IT infrastructure layer. They have firewalls, they have internal servers, right? We have routers, we have cloud, we have data center, right? Those are all just kind of IT infrastructure. Usually different teams inside of this control different aspects of these technologies, as well as kind of security layers all the way through. We think about how that supports the application layer, applications, the ways that we're processing the databases is a big one, right? That's where all the good data is. We have applications like our HR, our payroll software, different things that we're feeding data into and processing it there. At our top layer are our users, right? We know we have endpoints here, we have laptops, mobile devices, but our users are also the biggest vector, right? Humans are gonna be one of the biggest things that disrupt our data, not just our security, right? All of that's connected. And so this all is connected, right? There's different layers here. Let's look at protecting. There are a ton of ways to protect that. I like to refer to this as the big scary vendor slide. It's a big scary vendor slide. It changes. This isn't even all-inclusive of different ways that we can look at security and the solutions that people provide. So these are technologies, these are combinations of technologies, these are managed layers inside of all of that as well. And so it's complicated, right? When we talk about that, not only do we have to make sure that when we're working with customers, their internal stakeholders understand their data, understand their networks, how that all plays in together, and then they're gonna battle for budget, right? Where are we spending our money, what these different solutions provide, and each customer is gonna have a different need, a different story, and that's all okay, right? But it's important that we work with a lot of our partners, work together to understand, but ultimately, what are they actually looking for, right? We're protecting their data in what way? So again, we know about firewalls, we know about endpoint solutions, so we're gonna talk about a little bit of a different way to help companies understand how else to protect their data, right? Outside of these normal kind of traditional technologies that we're all kind of used to and used to hearing. Like I mentioned, it's a very ambitious agenda. These guys have absolutely hung in with me, saying, it's a lot, it's a lot to cover. We're gonna get through as much as possible that we can. Again, we'll be available afterwards as well, but we're gonna try to power through these. As we get into each of these kind of journey pieces of how data goes from more of the outside into our organizations, we're gonna go through a quick definition of what that means. In security, we love acronyms, lots of acronyms, and we're gonna talk a little bit high level about what is this technology or what are these acronyms that we're talking about. And then as we go through the panel and as we start discussing these technologies and what we're seeing, you're gonna have on the screens a quick way to think about, it's in the back of your mind while we're going through this, think about market relevance, and we're gonna be thinking about opportunity identifiers. So ways to listen for these kinds of conversations, and ways to identify where an opportunity for conversation might come up. DDoS and DNS, really, really quickly, high level. DDoS is distributed denial of service. So when someone's being targeted, a resource, a server, they're gonna try to flood and overwhelm that resource, ultimately bringing it down so no one else can get into those resources, get into that website, and just kind of render it unavailable. DNS is domain name system. Two ways to think about this. Externally, we think about it as the phone book of the internet, right? No one wants to remember all the different pieces of an IP address. They want to go to google.com. Google's probably not a good example. It's 8.8.8.8, but some other ones, you just want to go to Amazon, right? You don't want to have to know all the IPs behind it. Internally, we also see customers do this, most organizations do this, to help route traffic internal to their system and forward traffic a little bit easier. So we look at DNS and DDoS. So we're gonna go first to Cato. So we're gonna go first to Paul.
Yeah.
And how are we looking at this from the Cato perspective, and what are you guys seeing in regards to the evolution kind of in DDoS and DNS?
Yeah, so I mean, specifically in the DNS world, we talk about having the servers externally that you're accessing to look up a name, but that same protocol can actually be used as a method to infiltrate a network or exfiltrate things from it. Because the DNS system is so critical to everything that we do, attackers can use that to get data out, and so we leverage machine learning and capabilities to actually protect that environment, because DNS is a critical part of our infrastructure. So it's one way we can approach that and protect customers in that space.
Beautiful. And let's get that Akamai perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. DDoS basically is the idea of sending so much traffic to a website or to a network that the legitimate people can no longer communicate with it. 85% of DDoS attacks we see include attacks against DNS, right? So if I can take your DNS servers offline and people can't ask that question, which is, what is the name, or what is the IP address of the name I just presented in my browser, then you can take this system offline. So it's really interesting to see how that kind of goes hand in hand. The other thing I think is interesting too, to Paul's point, simply put, some DNS systems are not properly configured. So I can query your DNS server and ask for a name of maybe a critical system and just guess. And if I get a response, now I know where your dev servers are. Or maybe if you're working remotely, now I know vpn.companyname.com is a URL that I'm going to DDoS so that your people working remotely can no longer work. So there's a lot of strategies to kind of take from, hardening DNS, but also protecting the systems as well.
Excellent. So not necessarily new technologies, but new ways that we need to think about how we're protecting these two really critical pieces that are more external to our organizations, but still very, very important when we're looking at ultimately how do we kind of create that shell, right? How do we make sure that our data is going to be available and then also not kind of mess with or tweak with, especially when we're looking at making sure business continues to run when the times that we're being attacked and seeing that increase, right, across those different verticals. All right, our next visit here is Microsoft, and we think about Windows environment hardening. And so when we talk about environment hardening, we're thinking about all the different processes and ways that we're looking at securing the system, right, and reducing the attack surface. So the more we put loads, the more we make a little bit more complicated of platforms, and Windows, of course, Microsoft, super complicated, right? There's lots of different things that we can turn on and use it in different ways. The more we enable that to do cool business process things, we make it a lot more complicated and a lot larger of an attack surface, right? More connections means we can process things faster, but that's increase in risk. So Microsoft is everywhere. 70% of organizations use Microsoft Azure and trust it. Of the Fortune 100s, 95% are trusting of Azure. Then we look out of the Fortune 500s, 4 out of every 5 will be using Office 365. I think we're only going to see that increase, right? Office 365 is everywhere. It makes things a lot easier, but of course, huge attack vectors. It's the same kind of underlying system technologies, easy to learn, right? And then use what we learn in attack companies that we know have Windows, right? If everybody has Windows, the attackers are going to study Windows and figure out the best way to use that information and target everybody. So we look at, sorry about that. So Microsoft Zero Trust Capability Mapping. So what you're seeing here on the screen, again, complicated looking, but we're seeing that Microsoft has, just in this Zero Trust security model of Microsoft, we're looking at, or Azure, all these are different technology solutions for security. So these are all different security processes, different ways that we're looking at securing just Microsoft. So some of those names kind of sound familiar. Defender, we can use Defender in a couple different ways inside of Azure. So different ways that we're looking at just breaking this complicated thing down and making it, at least less complicated and scary, but more secure. So we're going to start first with Forest. So we're looking at SMBs, right? SMBs are going to use Microsoft. Yep. So how are we looking at it? Even though they might not be able to afford this entire Zero Trust structure, what are some gaps that you're seeing or some availability things that we're looking at?
So Melanie, I got to tell you a secret.
Yeah.
Microsoft isn't a cybersecurity company. No, hey, listen, they have incredible cybersecurity features. I know that that's part of the conversation here, but the reality is, especially for the SMBs, until you get into, call it E5 and some larger licenses, and or have a partner that can help you do the hardening that is on that slide over there, you don't have that advantage. And one of the big conversations we're having, especially with that small mid-market, or smaller mid-market, I should say, is where are you storing your information? I mean, more commonly than anything, you're storing it on OneDrive or for Google G Drive because it's cheap.
Yep.
That's a cheap, easy way to share all my stuff. But now all of my stuff is in that place. And outside of maybe a multi-factor type of solution that you have to protect access management to it, now everybody can get into this. And believe me, that is one of the areas that they are attacking the most. It's in the top 4 for sure in where they're trying to go. So you need to do a couple different things for this. Number one, put some identity access management around the darn OneDrive. Like, it's not inherent with your Microsoft license, again, unless you go upstream. So you can use a company like Coro or others to make sure you have something to protect against the access to that storage space. Then I would also tell you, I know that everybody is 100% effective with all their cybersecurity practices, but put some backup around it. Make sure you have a recovery piece to that. And I know there's a lot of good people actually that were on panels earlier that do that. So when you're having this conversation with your customers, that's a magic bullet. You will scare the pants off them very quickly, and I hate selling with FUD, but it's reality. Talk to them about making sure they have something around their OneDrive or G Drive or equivalent, and then make sure they have something around backup for it as well.
Absolutely. And we were looking at, yesterday in the security breakout session, we also shared a statistic that the average cost of a breach is $4.88 million. So yes, these technologies cost a lot. Yes, it might be a barrier to entry for some of the SMBs. They still have data to protect. As long as they're collecting data, they're processing data, everyone still has data to protect. They just might not have some of the cool shiny stuff that we might talk about a little bit later on, but they're still needing those recoveries, they're still needing the ability to not just access the data, but make sure ultimately when everyone gets breached, how are we going to be able to respond to that? Eric, also from here. So when we're looking at this from, again, the complicated slides, and we have, more of our enterprises or large businesses are able to toggle on and kind of look at configuring these pieces themselves, usually. What are some of the gaps that we're seeing, and are people really configuring this and running this well themselves?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. A lot of enterprise clients that we start working with, one of the first things we notice are things are not configured properly across the board, and it's tough, right? There's a lot of different security tools that are out there. Security resources are high in demand, and so typically when we first start working with folks, it's looking at the environment, looking what they have, but then start pushing out some standards from a configuration perspective. It was interesting, we had a very large Fortune 500 organization reach out to us here probably about 2 months ago. We started monitoring the information. They said, Eric, we need to get your DFIR team engaged. We've got a breach. Mm-hmm. I'm like, it's strange. We don't see anything on our map. And so as it turns out, what had happened is they had some developers out of India that had configured some stuff in the cloud, and they were working on cloud applications. And they wanted to make it easy for them to get into the environment, tying into what Forrest said, right? Really around identity. But they enabled RDP. And when our DFIR team got in, from the time that they had implemented the RDP access, it took about 20 minutes. Now, 20 minutes, what that relates to from a client perspective is all of their intellectual property, all of the application data was all compromised. Now, that's really where these configuration standards need to not only be for the corporate environment, but also the cloud, and also these other dev environments as well need to be really followed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Could not agree more, right? Especially when we're looking at teams largely that are increasingly outsourcing different services, working with teams around the world, they still need just as much access. And sometimes those protections are also hard when you're working with the same one person that's also doing everything else across your infrastructure, right? So yes, we need access. Yes, we can talk about location controls and things like that, but it gets really complicated when we do have a large remote workforce, right? We're also going to look at this from a Cato perspective. So Cato, when we look at, Paul from Cato, when we look at zero trust, right? And again, we talked about this a little bit yesterday in the breakout, where zero trust and defense in depth is a mindset, right? It's an approach to security. It's not a product in and of itself. So when we think about environment hardening, and we think about the different ways that Cato sees that inside of your network when they have kind of everything on that same kind of pipeline and the root structure there, what are you all seeing when it comes to ways that customers can look at hardening their environments?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, just hardening one particular operating system doesn't cover the whole gamut, right? So being able to look at everything that we see on the network, which is pretty much everything at this point, gives us the capability to very tightly control who has access to what at what time, for what reason, and what are they running on those devices. So using any of that data, we can understand their identity, understand the applications that they're trying to use, and very easily control who gets access to what, and the default is none, right? So when we talk about the zero trust, by default, we're not going to allow anything that happens there, even though the connectivity exists, until such time that we decide as a business that we're going to allow this particular person or group of people or a characteristic of an endpoint device, et cetera, to get access to other things. Until you do that, they just won't have that access, right? So being able to provide that seamlessly without having to install special connectors or do new different aspects of your job is very critical for us to be able to provide that in a very straightforward way.
So there's a very fine balance that a lot of us have to play when it looks like businesses want to be secure and want to lock things down, but you also don't want the CEO yelling at you because all of a sudden they can't access something they've always been able to access. We need business, we need security, we need things to keep moving, but a lot of times at what risk is that, right? So we need to lock things down, we need to have good visibility, but we also need people to do their jobs, right? And the ability to do that really quickly. So moving on, we're doing great. The next one is API and web application security. When we look at this, API is an application programming interface. This is really just a set of rules that help communications talk to each other, right? So we're talking about servers. These are the things that help us push and pull with different applications. Usually third parties is what helps us do response actions. We talk about that from a response perspective. My SIEM solution, right, my collector sees this. How do I make sure that my Palo Alto firewall responds, or my different pieces of technology respond to each other in that kind of quick way? Web applications, we see this as a software, right? When it's hosted on the internet, all of this needs to be locked down, right? These are all connections, these are all things that are processing data. Are people doing this and seeing this in a really effective way? So when we look at this from Akamai, so web application, so API and web app security is really important. So can you expand a little bit more for us on that topic in general, but also how you guys approach that from Akamai?
Sure. I think one thing that's kind of interesting, when you're getting hit with a DDoS attack, the idea of saying, hey, we're going to block the bad guy traffic, it gets a lot more specific when it starts being targeted at your APIs or your web applications. You can't take an axe off the wall and say, cut the hard lines. Like in the movies, there's always an axe in the data center. You have to continue to ingest that traffic while you figure out what is the application attack, how are they going about this, and then you start to segment off that attack traffic to a separate path, if you will. APIs are really interesting, though, because they expect automation. Mm-hmm. So against web applications, typically you can say, oh, well, our customers don't come in and instantly enter their username and password and instantly shop and click and add and whatever. But your APIs will do that because that's part of the flow of how they function. So being able to identify what good API traffic looks like, identify all the API transactions within your environment, because a majority of the APIs that function holistically in the environment, they do not go through the web application firewall. So you're almost missing a certain percentage of the APIs because the back-end transactions are all east to west inside the environment. Akamai recently acquired a company called No Name Security, which is looking at all of the API traffic within your environment, building a map of what it looks like, the relationship they have with each other, running posture assessments against them, and then trying to figure out, is someone abusing the business logic of how this API functions? Because just like we learned with bots and web applications, bots over time got really, really good at looking like human transactions. And that became a very difficult thing to deal with on the web app side. But the API side, because it's all automated, you need machine learning, you need kind of access to a big data platform to be able to identify, when it looks like a problem, even if it's something that's kind of, like a business logic abuse. You need a way to be able to identify what that looks like. And that's something that we do, for our customers.
Absolutely. And those are also changing. So with Eric, we talked a little bit before about an offensive perspective of this. So knowing that APIs are business need, right? We need fast, we need automation, we need lots of things talking to each other. It also needs to be really accessible. That's a lot of threat, right? There's a lot of risk there. There's a lot of connections that maybe hopefully someone's watching, right? And so when we look at that from an offensive perspective, what are we seeing in API security? And then we're looking at the tools that are trying to monitor and protect that. How well are we really doing and kind of what's getting through?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. One of the first things when we start off, we do a lot of application testing at TrustWave. And when I get on these calls, I ask our clients, I'm like, tell us about the API. They're like, well, we know a little bit about it. I'm like, do you have any drawings, diagrams? So it really helps us understand what we're testing. They're like, that guy left 2 years ago. Just treat it like a black box. And so it's really sort of scary, right, that a lot of these APIs are running, but the power that these APIs actually have and what they can do. And as such, I think T-Mobile was breached last year, 37 million user accounts as a result of an API attack, right? Now, at TrustWave, a few things that we do to help our clients is obviously we've talked a little bit about our offensive testing with application and API testing. But really, we start getting into the SDLC, right? As developers are developing these applications and these APIs, we actually have a testing service that we can actually test that in the dev environment, test it in the UAT environment. And again, we'll get certain developers that'll send us 3 or 4 different requests daily to test it. They make a fix, test it, make the fix, and then they move it on to the next phase. So it's definitely a huge issue.
Absolutely. We talked a little bit before about harmony. Right, so hopefully our developer team is playing nice with our infrastructure team. Hopefully security is aware of what anybody else is doing, right? So we're not blocking any of those steps along the way. So a lot of things, again, we want to make sure that not only the code is correct and it's tested before it gets rolled out, but considering all the different attack vectors we have there, a lot of people need to have eyes on this, right? There's a lot of different tools and services that we can look at. But it's absolutely a huge attack vector. And again, like Microsoft, one of those things that almost all of your organizations are going to have implemented inside of their systems. Next up, we're going to do secure internet and application database access. So several different things and some very fun acronyms. So secure internet, pretty self-explanatory. We're going to make sure that we're locking down people's access. So users, devices, access to the internet is the biggest reason why we're all here, right? Internet is everywhere. We use it all the time. Huge attack vectors. A secure application and secure database access, kind of similar, right? Kind of in the name. We want to make sure that we're locking down the people who should be accessing that, making sure they're only accessing the data they should be there right, as well. Hopefully it's not being misused. Hopefully no one's unauthorized getting in there, especially to our databases. So when we're looking at this, we're going to go kind of around the room. We're looking at secure internet and access. So again, it's kind of in the name, but what are some war stories? So there's some very fun things here. What are some war stories that we're looking at when people do not lock down their internet access or application or database, right? Huge data, everyone's against the root of what we're talking about here today. But what are some war stories where, even though these are common, right? We know that we want to lock this stuff down. What are some ways that people are actually getting in and not too doomsday, but you can doomsday if you want to, ways that people are still getting owned when they don't have the proper tools in place? Of course.
So this is when features tell, stories sell. I'll give you 2 quick ones, actually. The first one, unfortunately, actually happened to an employee. Somebody that actually knows about this. But unfortunately, it was not him that was compromised. He was buying a house. And the title company that they were working with didn't know, like most companies, that they had been compromised months and months before. And that title company, which was working obviously with the banks and so on to make sure that they got the ACH information to collect money, waited for the day when they had some of their biggest closes going on. And the morning of, that this person was supposed to be closing on a house, his spouse got an email, because everything's electronic nowadays, got an email with, hey, send your payment over to this ACH number. So, of course, they do. He shows up to sign off on everything and excited about buying the house, and they're like, where's my money? Uh-oh. They found out that that breach had gone out to a bunch of different buyers and that money was gone. And this was a simple, I wouldn't say simple, but it was a challenge where the title company didn't know that access was getting outside of their walls and that information about their customers was available. So nobody did anything wrong from the buyer standpoint, but they were affected very, very heavily. And the other one was that education thing I just saw on the other slide there. Anybody who has kids under 18, go put a credit lock on your kids, like today. No joke. Because what happens is that those kids, because schools are notoriously low on security, your kids' information is getting out. And when they turn 18, is the first thing they think about to go and open a credit line? Probably not. But the bad guys are. And that's a really, really bad phone call when you have to go and figure out how to protect your kids that did absolutely nothing wrong. So those are great areas, unfortunately, great areas to go and have conversations with businesses and tell them a real story about real people that are being affected by them not doing the things they could be doing to harden their security.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll throw one out there. Just the biggest kind of application access breach that happened probably within the past 10 years was the Target breach. And you look at what happened there, where they had a relationship with an HVAC vendor. That HVAC vendor was able to VPN into their environment and work with the controls of these systems, right? The irony, though, is that, and when we talk about identity and making sure the right person has access to the right thing, this was the right person in terms of the account being used, and they had the right access, which was access to connectivities. So what it comes down to is least privilege and the idea of re-architecting the status quo of how networks connect to each other. So VPN connects the whole network stack of your device into the network stack of the network you're connecting to, which you may only need access to one application or one specific web interface or one SSH session. So when you start talking about zero trust network access, ZTNA, you're basically saying, hey, we're not going to connect the whole network stack because we've seen that all these ancillary services that you're not using can be hijacked and be used by the attackers. Whether or not you have your kids, they're working from home or doing school from home during COVID, and of course their computer got messed up, so they use your computer, your work computer, and now you're infected with malware. That same accidental access can be given via those channels. So this is something we look at very seriously because most of the modern data breaches that weren't application-based, they were VPN and network-based, they were using actual credentials that someone got because LinkedIn had a data breach, and your username used to be very specific for each system you connected to. You guys remember, that's someone already has ladiesman227. That wasn't mine ever, but so you got to create a unique username. Well, now your username is standardized with your email address. So that email address is 50% of the equation they need. So if I use the same email address and password on LinkedIn, now someone goes to my corporate authentication portal for VPN, and they enter in the credentials that LinkedIn already had for me. And if that works, then all they got to do now is trick me into pressing yes on my 2FA response, which most people do. At 8 o'clock in the morning, you see something come up, or they social engineer you to do that. But the point is, they can get access via the same means that you get access. So we have to break that system. We have to break the dichotomy of the status quo of how VPNs connect, how MFA works. The fact that a bad guy could get an authentication token sent to their computer is already a broken factor of MFA, something that the FIDO2 Alliance and WebAuthn together has tried to compete against. So that kind of stuff happens all the time. And even with APIs, the same thing happened with an API vendor portal to Dell. Dell had 42 million customer accounts access because once this attack group got access to the API, they said, hey, we're going to be a vendor. This means we're a mom and pop shop, we're reselling these computers, and we're going to help fix them. So they got a vendor ID. They wrote some code to reverse engineer the vendor ID to find out what all the other vendor IDs look like based on math. So then they used their actual API access that they had legitimate access to, of course, Dell at the time didn't realize they're querying 42 million times other vendor IDs, which they probably shouldn't also have had access to, but they did. So there's a lot of, again, not to scare you, but also it's scary because there's so many different ways in that, once attackers get creative, they can really do whatever they want. Because nobody's
MFA doesn't mean you're secure, right? There's different ways to get around that.
Yeah.
So I'll give you one last one. How many folks here talk to clients about data security? How many, let me rephrase that. How many of your clients come to you and say, hey, you know what, Bridgepointe, we're looking at securing our data. What can you do for me? Typically not a lot, right? A lot of the things that we're saying is like, hey, we're getting hit with ransomware. What can you do to help with that? At the end of the day, the digital gold, right, is really in the database, right? And this is an area where Trustwave, we actually, one of the few companies out there that have a database protection solution. And I get pulled into a lot of these calls, and it's my favorite question to ask clients. I'm like, how many databases do you have in your environment? And I typically get, 75, maybe 100. So we say, okay, write it down. Said, do you know what they are? Like, yeah, maybe SQL, maybe Oracle. And so we start up a POC, we deploy it, and come back 2 weeks later, and they're like, oh my gosh, Eric, we have 1,100 databases in our environment. But the interesting thing is, they have no idea. First of all, they just discovered these new databases from Shadow IT. But the next part is what's in these databases, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about protection on, I believe, the next slide. But it's really an interesting story about you've got to know what you have, and then once you have that, you've got to secure it properly. So.
No, it's a great segue. Let's jump into it. We're almost running out of time. We have a couple more slides. Advanced technologies in focus. Last one here, DLP and DSPM. Really quickly, what these acronyms mean, data loss prevention is DLP. This is a combination, right? People, process, technology to make sure that our sensitive data is not lost, misused, accessed without approval. So again, sensitive data. How do we know what data we have and how do we know it's sensitive? And then how do we protect that, right? That's going to be when we're looking more at DSPM or data security posture management. Different tools, different processes, different ways of approaching it. But how are we going to look at discovering where all of our structured or unstructured data is? And then how are we going to monitor where it is, who's locating it, who's using it, who's accessing it, and how is it being used, right? So maybe we know, hopefully we know where our data is. We'll discover where the data is. If it's structured or unstructured, start classifying it and really start locking things down. So we'll start with Paul here. One of the things that we're going to talk about with DLP and DSPM, sometimes they're usually thought of as, we call them advanced technologies here, but like we just talked about before, small businesses still need to protect their data. We know that large businesses and sometimes some of your larger, more mature cyber programs don't have this yet either, but everybody needs it. So when we look at DLP or DSPM, what are some ways that we can look at finding these opportunities and opening customers' conversations about why they need to look at these kind of technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a customer perspective, being able to identify what's important to their business, like that they have PII data of their customers, even their own internal information that they want to protect, and how easy is it going to be for them to actually implement that, right? We get a lot of customers because they have bought some service overall, and SASE encompasses DLP as part of our offering, and they've never had a chance to actually put it into place because it was so complicated to do. So having a way for, especially a smaller customer, be able to take baby steps to start looking at the data that they're transferring to know that, look, I don't want to let this team get resumes out to the world. I don't want to allow them to leak our SKUs of important information out to the world, and being able to do that in a way that's very methodical, that gives them a lot of visibility, and that we can help them do that very quickly. So that's a great approach to start talking about what's important to them, what they need to protect, and how they might look at doing that as an overall solution.
Excellent. Forrest, what are your tips? Concerns?
Yeah, I was going to say, in the essence of time here, come see all of us at the supplier fair, because we have a lot more to talk about than we're going to do here. But I also think about user data governance. So DLP, DSPM are a extension of that. but it starts with user data governance. How am I delivering the right kind of access to the right people in those departments? And to simplify that, my HR department may need to have PHI information, but they probably don't need PCI information.
Right.
Just like my finance team probably needs the PCI information, but doesn't need PII information. And I know you guys are dealing with that because contact center and everything else you guys have been dealing with, and we've talked about compliance ad nauseum at different panels. It is here. And again, you have to start looking at the user data governance side. Who's excluded, who is included, and what kind of access and what kind of information should they or should they not have? Because if you don't start there, how in the hell are you locking your stuff down? Like how do you know who gets what? So start there with that conversation and then drive it into the DSPM conversation.
Like a stepping stone, right?
Yes.
The processes, how do we get them to get there? Eric, really quickly, and then we'll Tony.
I'll just give you, same concept. I'm going to give you a different lens on it. CMMC, if you're not familiar with it, Rule 32 just went into effect here maybe about a month ago. It basically is controlling your data at the end of the day, controlling the ITAR data. And this is an area where if a Northrop Grumman basically wins a large contract, basically all of their subs have to now comply with CMMC. And it gets down to controlling where that ITAR data is. This is an area where we're helping a lot of companies go down that path today. But I'll just leave you with that based on time. If you'd like to talk about this anymore, again, all of us are available after the session, so appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will attempt to be brief, and it's not my strong suit, but the whole idea of look at the organizations where data breaches have occurred, where PII and sensitive information has been extracted. It's not like they weren't doing security properly. It's not like they didn't have all the best, best of breed tools. There's something that happens when you get inside of a network that the devices are expected to be able to talk to each other. So once someone gets in, they can really peruse, and it may take time to see, the different communication paths, but you have to understand how devices talk to each other, because no matter what you're doing from a policy standpoint, where it should be, what should be, or how it's labeled, if someone has proper access, because they have access to someone's machine who has access to this data, if you see something anomalous with how the devices are talking to each other or out to the internet, that's where you need to be able to apply security control. The other controls are almost policy management centric, but the active, like what data is moving and how is it moving and what is actually transpiring, not what does our policy say, is also very important to look at. And I think that's an area that a lot of organizations are starting to focus on more and more.
Especially, right, those regulations, that's where we get fines, right? This is where the government starts locking us down. You can't get around them, right? It's not like you're going to cancel a contract, the government's going to come after you. So when we talk about some things like that, right, that's what's going to play into conversations about enhancing policies, not just for original security concerns. We mentioned AI. We haven't mentioned AI. I think there's a ticker of how many times you should mention AI in a conversation.
How many shots are we on now?
So when we think about AI and the regulations that are coming into that in 2025, all part of these conversations. So some super quick highlights. 5 key takeaways. Data is the goal, right? That's what we're all after. It's what they're all after. Cybersecurity solutions aren't just for large enterprises. Some of these are very accessible still for SMBs, especially when we look at the managed layers on top of that to really help them implement and control this. Microsoft's everywhere. It's going to be a biggest target. It's going to cost to protect that data. It's going to cost even more when it's breached and you have to recover from it. And then it's broad, right? It's complicated. We have teams here to help. We have great partners to help us as well. So this is all, again, very complicated, but very accessible, all things that we can all do here. So we don't have time for Q&A. Again, the panel's going to be up here, going to be at the supplier fair here shortly. But thank you all so much for your time.